Several bands and artists from the 60s managed to carry their success into the 70s, but for every survivor, there were dozens who slowly faded into nostalgia. And just as those 60s stars were slipping into obscurity, a new force was beginning to take over the British charts in the early 70s. Glam rock had arrived, and artists like David Bowie, T.rex, Slade or The Sweet were suddenly everywhere, dominating the music scene. But glam rock wasn't just glitter and platform boots, it was also a sound characterized by stomping beats, crunchy guitars, chant-along choruses, and a return to the simplicity of 50s rock and roll. And while most 60s bands who tried to jump on the glam bandwagon didn't suddenly appear in sequined jumpsuits and platform boots, although some of them did, many embraced the sound in an attempt to revive their careers. In this video, we'll explore 60s stars who went glam in the 70s. Let's begin. The Troggs appeared on the British music scene in 1966 and scored several major hits with tracks like Wild Thing, With a Girl Like You or Love Is All Around. But by 1973, the group hadn't had a hit since late 1967, and they were already seen as a distant memory from the past. That same year, the Troggs released this excellent track called Strange Movies, which was a clear attempt to tap into the glam sound that was dominating the music scene during that period.
There was Bill and Sue, chicken sitting there.
The track has a certain swagger. It's theatrical and a bit cheeky, built around a crunchy riff and a stomping beat that wouldn't have sounded out of place in an album by T.rex. And yet it still sounded unmistakably like the Troggs. After all, the back-to-basic spirit of early glam rock shared a lot of DNA with the Troggs' own stripped-down style, making this glam-inspired direction feel like a natural fit. And in keeping with the sexual undertones featured in many of their songs, Strange Movie was a track explicitly centered on the experience of watching a porn film. The single received a few positive reviews in the press, and the Troggs were even invited to perform the song on a David Bowie television special from 1973. But despite the favorable reviews and the television exposure, the single failed to chart.
Keep on dancing, keep on dancing, keep on dancing, hey, keep on dancing, keep on dancing.
Brian Poole and the Tremeloes were formed in Dagenham in 1958, and they landed a few major hits during the early days of Beatlemania. But the hits started to dry up in 1965, and Brian Poole decided to quit the band to start a solo career, so the Tremeloes continued as a four-piece. After a couple of unsuccessful singles in 1966, the group landed a massive international hit in 1967 with Silence is Golden, which reached #1 on both sides of the Atlantic. This marked the beginning of a period of enormous chart success for the group. But by 1971, their presence in the charts started to wane. And with the advent of glam rock, the Tremeloes bought platform boots and adopted a glam-tinged sound that was clearly inspired by bands like Slade, and especially The Sweet.
Get your cycle and ride on, ride away. Don't you know you better not stay? Get your cycle and ride on, ride on. You better be gone.
Ride On was perhaps the highlight of their glam phase. It featured the required stomping beat and a catchy chorus that sounded like a cross between T.rex and The Sweet. But this wasn't the only glam single that the Tremeloes released during that period. Between 1972 and 1975, the group issued several singles with a strong glammy influence. Despite their attempts to recapture the chart success they had enjoyed in previous years, none of the singles they released during their glam phase managed to make a dent on the British charts.
You know you make me wanna shout, woo, shout, woo.
Lulu was only 14 years old when her version of Shout reached the top 10 in Britain in 1964, giving her her first major hit. Between 1964 and 1969, she enjoyed major success, scoring 9 top 10 singles and even starring in films like To Sir with Love. But just like many stars of the 60s, Lulu struggled to find success in the early 70s. In fact, between 1970 and 1973, none of her singles managed to chart, and it seemed like she was doomed to become yet another 60s artist left behind by the new decade. In 1973, however, Lulu teamed up with David Bowie and recorded a cover of The Man Who Sold the World, which was produced by Bowie himself alongside guitarist Mick Ronson.
Your face to face with the man who sold the world.
I met him in a hotel in the lobby. He said, come see my show tonight. After the show, like 10:30, 11, the party started. And during the party, during the night, he said to me, I want to record you. I'm going to make a big hit record with you.
I used the Pin-Ups lineup to back her, including Mick Ronson on guitar and Ainsley Dunbar on drums, and I played the sax section on overdubs. I still have a very soft spot for that version, though to have the same song covered by both Lulu and Nirvana still bemuses me to this day.
The B-side was Watch That Man, another Bowie composition that had just appeared on the album Aladdin Sane. The single was released in January 1974, and it marked Lulu's return to the British charts after 4 years of virtually no success, reaching number 3 in the UK and also becoming a sizable hit in several European countries.
I have some sadness in a way that it didn't continue, and that was because David was on a path of it that really was not my path at that time. And it's been documented, what he was doing. He was experimenting, and when I was in New York, because I went to New York after The Man Who Sold the World was a hit, and there was a lot of hanging around, and I thought, I can't do this. It's a little bit scary,
The Swinging Blue Jeans were formed in Liverpool in the early 60s, and they landed a few major hits during the early days of Beatlemania, with songs like Hippie Hippie Shake and You're No Good, both of which were top 5 hits in Britain and in several European countries. By 1965, however, the success of bands like the Rolling Stones, the Kinks and the Who had completely changed the music scene. And by 1966, most of the Merseybeat bands that had ruled the top 40 in 1963 and 1964 had already disappeared from the charts. By 1974, the Swinging Blue Jeans hadn't had a hit in a decade, and just like several other 60s bands still active in the 70s, they tried to jump on the glam bandwagon with this track called Dancing. The group didn't adopt a glam image, and we probably should be thankful for that. But the song had all the hallmarks of 70s glam rock, a stomping beat, hand claps, and a catchy sing-along chorus clearly designed to take British discotheques by storm. But the Swinging Blue Jeans were inevitably seen as relics from the past, and the single went largely unnoticed. A few months later, the group once again tried to cash in on the glam craze by releasing a glammed-up version of their old hit Hippie Hippie Shake, but once again, the single was a flop. Marty Wilde was part of the first wave of British rockers who emerged in the late 50s and early 60s. And out of all the artists featured in this video who attempted to jump on the glam bandwagon, his attempt at becoming a glam performer was by far the most bizarre. His success continued into the early 60s, but his popularity began to dwindle with the arrival of the Beatles and the rest of the so-called British invasion bands. By the mid to late 60s, he had shifted his focus to songwriting, penning hits for bands like Status Quo and The Casuals, and he even scored a hit himself in 1968 with Abergavenny, which was released in the US and Canada under the pseudonym Shannon, one of several aliases he used over the years. But his most unusual reinvention came in 1973, when he decided to embrace a glammed-up style. Wilde adopted the name Zappo and began performing in a Superman-style costume, complete with a glitter helmet. arguably one of the most spectacularly absurd outfits in glam history. The result was Rock and Roll Crazy, released as a single in November 1973. The song was heavily influenced by the glam sound of Gary Glitter and even featured the signature stomping beat popularized by the Glitter Band during that period. The single was a complete commercial failure, and his later 70s singles met the same fate. However, just like several other tracks featured in this video, Rock and Roll Crazy later gained cult status among fans of 70s glam rock through its appearance on several compilations of 70s junk shop glam singles. In the 80s, Marty Wilde enjoyed a career resurgence when he teamed up with his son Ricky as a songwriting partner and began writing hits for his daughter Kim Wilde, including Kids in America, which became a massive worldwide hit and turned her into a major star. Just like the Swinging Blue Jeans and Brian Poole and the Tremeloes, Billy J. Kramer and the Dakotas reached their peak of popularity during the early days of Beatlemania. In fact, the group was managed by Brian Epstein, and Kramer was given a series of songs specially written for him by John Lennon and Paul McCartney, which helped launch him into stardom. The group scored 6 major hits in Britain and even landed a couple of top 10 hits in America with songs like Bad to Me and Trains and Boats and Planes. But by mid-1965, their chart success began to wane. And after 4 consecutive flops, Kramer parted company with the Dakotas in 1966. Kramer then moved into cabaret, adopting a more middle-of-the-road style, and released 7 singles between 1967 and 1973, none of which managed to chart. But just like many 60s pop singers who were still active in the early 70s, he decided to jump on the glam bandwagon in 1973 with a song called Blue Jean Queen. The track was written and produced by Mick Green, who had played with Johnny Kidd and the Pirates in the early 60s and had later joined Billy J. Kramer and the Dakotas in 1964. But as you've probably already guessed, the single was once again a flop.
And now climbing steadily up the charts, a new one from David Bowie. This one's called Starman.
70s glam rock could broadly be divided into 2 categories. On the one hand, there were bands like Slade, The Sweet, and Gary Glitter, who generally focused on simple, high-energy, catchy songs aimed at the singles market. On the other hand, you had artists like David Bowie, T.rex, Roxy Music, and Mott the Hoople, who had many songs that embraced the characteristics that came to define 70s glam rock, but also often pursued a more artsy and sophisticated approach. And this brings us to the album Cosmic Wheels, released by Donovan in 1973.
I should be rolling down the skyway on my cosmic wheels.
Now, the rise of glam rock didn't prompt Donovan to don glitter outfits or start writing stomping, chant-along anthems about clapping your hands and stomping your feet. But Cosmic Wheels is clearly influenced by the kind of material that T.rex and especially David Bowie were releasing at the time. The similarities are particularly evident in the production style, which is highly reminiscent of the work Tony Visconti was doing with Bowie and T.rex during that period. And even the subtle string arrangements echo the sort of orchestrations Visconti frequently employed.
Cosmic wheels. Cosmic wheels.
Donovan's signature style is still present, but several tracks on the album wouldn't have sounded out of place on records like Aladdin Sane or Tanks.
Take you out, a hollow car, far in the winter, lay no season teasing, black leather kid. Have some fun out in the country, celebrate your music in the open air.
Donovan's vocal delivery on songs like Maria Magenta even seems to suggest that he may have taken some influence from Roxy Music's vocalist Brian Ferry.
My copper go-go girl, she like a showgirl, delightful Dolores, you are the one.
Donovan also seemed to move away from the overtly hippie themes of his earlier work, and some of the songs embraced the cosmic and space-tinged imagery that had become central to many of Bowie's songs from that era, something that is especially evident on the album's title track.
I should be rolling down the skyway on my cosmic wheels.
All of this is why Cosmic Wheels has often been described by critics and fans alike as a glam folk album. And even though it isn't usually regarded as one of Donovan's classic records, I personally consider it to be one of his best albums and a particularly fascinating entry in his catalogue. Barry Ryan first achieved success in the mid-60s as part of a duo with his twin brother Paul. Together they scored 4 top 20 singles in 1965 and 1966. But in 1968, Paul stepped away from performing to focus exclusively on songwriting, and Barry embarked on a solo career, marking the start of a period of enormous success for him. The song Eloise, which was written and produced by his brother Paul, became a massive international hit in late 1968, reaching number 2 in Britain, topping the charts in 17 countries, and reportedly selling over 3 million copies worldwide. Barry Ryan released several other successful singles throughout 1969 and 1970, but by 1971 the hits had stopped coming. And in 1973, just like the artists featured in this video, Paul and Barry Ryan started experimenting with the glam sounds that were dominating the charts at the time in an effort to recapture his earlier success. The result was Glad to Know You, released under the name Paul and Barry Ryan, echoing their 60s partnership. Glad to Know You was an excellent glam-tinged song, but it also featured elements of 60s psychedelia, which was very unusual in 1973. In many ways, the track seemed to pioneer the sort of sound that American bands like Cheap Trick would popularize later in the mid to late 70s. The single was a commercial failure, and Polydor decided to drop Barry Ryan. He was then signed to Dawn Records, a subsidiary of Pi Records, and released another glam-influenced single.
You're saving all your money for a rainy day, so put your hands in my pockets, take your breath away. You said you'd do that, you said you'd do that, you said you'd do that.
But once again, it failed to make an impact, and he was dropped a second time. Even though both glam-era singles were unsuccessful at the time, they were later rediscovered and praised by glam rock enthusiasts, and they both have appeared on several compilations of 70s junk shop glam rarities, cementing their reputation as 2 cult favorites from the glam era.
Since you told me I'm your loving man and the baby that's a nice.
Neil Christian is mostly remembered as a one-hit wonder. His song That's Nice was a top 10 hit in the UK in 1966 and his only chart entry. But just like the previously mentioned Marty Wilde, Neil Christian was part of the first wave of British rockers who emerged in the late 50s and early 60s. And at various stages of their career, Neil Christian and the Crusaders featured several musicians who would later become legendary names, including future Deep Purple guitarist Ritchie Blackmore, Albert Lee, session pianist Nicky Hopkins, future Jethro Tull guitarist Mick Abrahams, and future Led Zeppelin leader Jimmy Page, who toured with Neil Christian and the Crusaders for approximately 2 years and played on several of his records throughout the 60s.
Green eyes.
The group famously used an old ambulance to travel to different gigs, and they built a reputation as one of the best live acts in Britain, while also enjoying considerable success in Germany. But chart success in Britain consistently eluded them. When Neil Christian finally scored his first and only UK hit in 1966, it seemed as though he had finally achieved the breakthrough he had been chasing since the early 60s. But unfortunately, his subsequent releases were all commercial failures. In the early 70s, Neil Christian became the manager of Crushed Butler, who are often cited as Britain's first proto-punk band. The group later changed their name to Tiger and released a powerful glam single called I'm an Animal. That same year, Neil Christian himself also decided to try his hand at glam rock, so he adopted a glammed-up image and released a strong glam single titled She's Got the Power.
I've got this woman, I love her so, I need her, I'll never let her go.
Like most of the glam singles featured in this video, the record failed to chart, but also like many of these overlooked releases, it later became a cult favorite among glam rock enthusiasts after being rediscovered through compilations of obscure glam singles from the 70s, such as the one you're seeing on screen.
I see the rain again. I must complain again.
Marmalade were formed in Scotland in 1966 after several years performing under the name Dean Ford and the Gaylords. Their very early releases as Marmalade didn't make much of an impact, but their luck changed in 1968 when they reached #1 in Britain with a Beatles cover. And the group achieved their peak of popularity in 1969 and 1970, with songs like Rainbow and Reflections of My Life, both of which reached #3 and became hits across Europe. Their subsequent 3 singles also enjoyed substantial success. But in 1972, Marmalade moved away from the gentle pop sound that had dominated some of their previous singles and adopted the stomping, guitar-driven glam style that was starting to take the British charts by storm. Their glam phase continued in 1973 with the boogie style Our House is Rocking. And in 1974, the group released yet another glam single, but this time with Bowie and T.rex producer Tony Visconti. Marmalade soon abandoned their glam experiment and returned to a more radio-friendly pop sound a few months later with Falling Apart at the Seams, which saw the group returning to the charts.
I can hear the grass grow. I can hear the grass grow.
The Move were formed in Birmingham in 1966 and led by Roy Wood. Between 1966 and 1972, the group scored 9 top 10 singles in Britain. They eventually dissolved in the early 70s when Roy Wood and Jeff Lynne formed Electric Light Orchestra. However, Wood decided to leave ELO shortly after the release of their first album, and he went on to form Wizzard. Wizzard became highly successful during the glam era. Their music blended glam elements with the lush wall of sound style of 60s producer Phil Spector, and their infectious, retro-inspired singles, combined with Roy Wood's outrageous makeup and wild hair, firmly positioned them as part of the glam movement. However, it would be unfair to describe Roy Wood as simply another 60s star jumping on the glam bandwagon. Wood had begun wearing extravagant makeup at least 2 years before glam fully exploded, and it could even be argued that the Move were one of the pioneers of the 70s glam sound. Their 1968 single Wild Tiger Woman is often cited as one of the earliest records to feature many of the hallmarks that defined glam rock later in the 70s. So in this case, it's not so much a story of a 60s artist chasing a trend, but rather of someone who helped shape the movement and then fully embraced it with Wizzard, pushing the image even further, while focusing on the kind of catchy 50s-inspired singles that became synonymous with the glam era. Wizzard went on to score 6 top 10 singles in the UK, with See My Baby Jive and Angel Fingers both reaching #1. And I Wish It Could Be Christmas Every Day became a festive classic that still receives heavy airplay every holiday season. And with that, we arrive at the end of this video. I hope you enjoyed this trip back to that strange and fascinating period when the stars of the 60s tried to navigate the glam rock explosion of the 70s. See you next time.